We are. But anyway, I was greeted with the news that they finally, there's been this big dispute about the renaming of the Washington Redskins.
Yes. Yeah.
And they finally resolved it, and
Yeah.
they've decided to, because of all of the bad energy and the protests about the name and the injustices and the lack of good faith on the part of everybody and the bad faith violation of agreements and everything, that they've now decided they're going to just name the team the Redskins. So that was the first piece of news that I got when I got into town. So anyway, but I had some long news is that there is a major pitched battle going on in Dallas now with the city. The mayor had decided that they decided that they were going to have a major celebration, which they're calling the 50th, actually, but that under no circumstances can anybody mention anything about a conspiracy to kill the president. And they decided they're going to have a major celebration, and because of the sequester, they've actually raised private funds to pay for the Blue Angels to have a flyover of Dealey Plaza. And it's going to be a celebration of the legacy of John F. Kennedy. And they just happened to have chosen the 22nd of November to do it. Just like we always celebrate, for Lincoln, we always celebrated the day he was killed at the theater, the Ford Theater. So that's what's happening right now. So, and they've said a thing where for security purposes, they'll be not allowed to have any banners or any signs saying anything about conspiracies. And for security purposes, they've also limited the number of people that can attend to 5,000. But in fact, it's their gala that they're going to have. There's only going to be 5,000 tickets, so you have to apply. And nobody from any of the conspiracy groups was granted tickets out of the 5,000 tickets. They had a security check you had to do. You had to submit your birth certificate, your passport, and your social security number, and your driver's license to them with your application for a ticket. And it turns out that the security check was being done by the public relations office for the mayor instead of the police or any other security agency. So virtually nobody made the grade. So and they said that if anybody wanted to have any kind of a demonstration or anything, that they could have it about a mile away. There's another park that they would allow any kind of demonstrations to be in, but Dealey Plaza itself was going to be completely contained with this celebration they were having of the legacy of President Kennedy. And they discovered that in the security check where they prohibited you from wearing any t-shirts that made any reference to the assassination, in addition to not having any signs or banners, they got all done with the security requirements, and then it was noticed that they had failed to say that you couldn't bring any guns to the demonstration.
No t-shirts.
So our people pointed that out to them, and they said, oh yes, that too.
No t-shirts.
So anyway, so there's this big Donnybrook going on, and so they got myself and Mark Lane and Anthony Summers and a lot of the folks that have written major books about this, who were going to be delivering the keynote speeches. They've now offered a hotel room over on the other side of town, where the mayor's office will make that available for free for people to come and have that discussion if they want, as long as they don't go near Dealey Plaza. So that's sort of the status of the thing right now. So I'm still scheduled to go do the major keynote on the 22nd. But that's on a Friday. So we'll be able to I'll be here for the class and everything for both of those days, the Tuesday and Thursday. Then I'll fly out of here after the Thursday class, and then we go do that. So anyways, that's sort of the logistics, but you see, I made it here, but my bags didn't, they're in Denver. So I just, decided but fortunately I have my notes, and the books that I needed to have. So today, and I want to thank Greg, for standing in, for last Tuesday, bringing you to the kind of doorway of the beginning of the next phase, the dealing with the assassination. That up until the time of the House Select Committee on Assassinations filing its report in 1979, there had been this big long set of debates going on and conflicts going on. I told you that after the report came out in '64, the Warren Commission report, there was that couple of year hiatus from '65 to '66 before the major books started coming out criticizing the Warren report. The kind of major position that was taken by the Warren Commission was cheered on by all the major news media in the United States and around the world, saying it was just this lone gunman and it doesn't really mean anything, there's no serious implications of this, it's just an unfortunate event that took place. And but then when the major books started coming out in '66 and '67, condemning it, there was this entire process that we've gone through already in deconstructing that affirmative narrative. And then more books kept coming out and kept coming out. And as I pointed out to you, what actually triggered the events that led to the establishment of the House Select Committee on Assassinations was the burglary. On June 17th of 1972, the burglary in the Watergate Hotel, in the arrest of this strange group of people made up of Cuban exiles and CIA people, and there began to be a lot of questions asked about that. And during the Watergate hearings, as we reviewed, information started to come out that made it clear that there had been active efforts undertaken to get the Warren Commission to conceal the fact that there had been an assassination team that had been put together to assassinate Fidel Castro. And Johnson used the excuse specifically to get Warren to be the chairman of the committee, saying, look, that no matter what else happens, you've got to conceal the fact that there was this assassination team that was assembled by the Kennedy brothers to kill Castro. Because if that information were to get out, people would then assume that Castro got that information and retaliated, and then we'd be back into a thermonuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. So that was where we were, and that on Tuesday, Greg brought you up to date with after the church committee reports came in, the Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse followed right after the Watergate hearings, and then the House Select Committee was put together. And as I understand, he told you some of the pushing and shoving that went on around the creation of this committee, what the scale of their jurisdiction was going to be, what type of power they would have, what kind of time limits they would have on in budget constraints that they would have. And they eventually came to almost to the very end of the period, and we're going to be preparing a report basically confirming the position that had been taken by the Warren Commission, even though they were criticizing some of the shortcomings and inadequacies of some of the investigations. They were going to end up having to basically say that Oswald clearly did it, and there wasn't any adequate evidence to support the fact that there was any kind of a larger conspiracy when the dicta belt was discovered. And I'm assuming that Greg talked to you in some detail about the dicta belt and what the implications of this were, so that they had this scientific acoustical evidence showing that there was another shot fired, so that there was a fourth shot that was fired, and that it was physically, mechanically impossible for anyone to have fired 4 shots with the Mannlicher or Carcano rifle in the period of time within which the shots had been bundled. And so that caused G. Robert Blakey, who had been steadfastly holding his ground against there being any conspiracy here, to have to acknowledge that given the fact that there was at least one other shooter, that there therefore had to be some type of larger conspiracy. So he, I think, rather intelligently dismissed the theory that maybe there were two completely independent people that decided to shoot the president at the same time.
Oh, wow.
Which there was actually a number of people tried to make that argument when they discovered that there was this other shot going on. And they were so desperately clinging to the fact that this couldn't have any larger implications that would be a rational explanation. But G. Robert Blakey didn't fall for that. And so he said, now we have to, in the short time that we have, in the last few weeks of preparing the report, we're going to have to kind of shift our ground and acknowledge that there probably was a conspiracy. Now, that you would think that unless you're going to accept the proposition that two people completely independently shot the president at the same time, that you'd be a little more firm about that. That it would have to be some kind of a coordinated conspiracy, at least between two people. But as far as he was willing to go was to state that based on this new acoustical evidence, it was more likely than not that the president had been killed as the result of a conspiracy. But rather than just stop at asserting that the obvious stopping it, well, I guess there just were two people, maybe Lee Harvey Oswald and one other person. What they actually did is moved very rapidly into accepting a lot of the information that had been developed by the investigators who were pressing very hard on G. Robert Blakey to accept the proposition of a much larger conspiracy. And so as soon as the dam gave way and G. Robert Blakey acknowledged that there was a conspiracy, this information started to flow in and to set the kind of general contours of what that conspiracy might look like. And the leading investigator that had been pushing forth these theories to the point of substantially alienating himself from G. Robert Blakey was Gaetan Fonzi. And Gaetan Fonzi has written he actually did his original article in the Washingtonian magazine, but it then got developed into a book that was called The Last Investigation. And he actually sets forth ample evidence demonstrating that there was a much larger conspiracy, and he pointed very much toward the Miami-based anti-Castro Cuban exile community, but pointed out that the element of that community that seemed to be the most likely involved in this were those that had very close relationships with the organized crime people in the Santos Trafficante family of the mob that was the boss in Havana, the mafia boss. So what we got in the conclusion of the published report of the Select Committee, the House Select Committee, was that the president, more probably than not, had been the victim of a conspiracy. And the most likely suspects as participants in that conspiracy were a certain element of Miami-based anti-Castro Cuban exiles and a certain element of the mafia. But they didn't really go into much detail about who they were. That they thought that basically getting that proposition set forth into the public consciousness was such a categorical change from the, by that time you got like a 16-year period of people all sitting there hearing that the official version of the assassination is that the president was killed simply by Lee Harvey Oswald, acting all by himself because he was a jerk, basically, and had a bad hair day or something. It was the basic theory. They actually had gone so far as to say that he was really upset because Marina had insisted upon having a dishwasher that he didn't want to provide for her, and he'd thrown a fit, and in his rage killed the president. And so that G. Robert Blakey thought that just getting that taken off the table and put onto the table of the public consciousness the fact that there was probably a conspiracy, in that there was this general description of a certain element of organized crime and a certain element of Miami-based Cubans was a categorical step that was important. Yes, Wes?
But if you take quotes from his report, it just looks like he's denouncing them. He says, at first, he says, the organized crime was not involved, but certain elements may have been involved.
That's right.
And then it says, same thing about the
Cuban
Cuban
yeah.
exiles. So if you take that quote from them, if all you take is a quote, then all you see is that they weren't involved.
Well, what he was actually saying, and it's peculiar, and we'll get into some of this about who G. Robert Blakey was as to why he would talk like that. But he was saying, I want to make it really clear that I'm not saying that organized crime as a whole was involved in it. I'm saying there was a certain element of them that was involved in it. Because Blakey had worked for many, many years. Blakey was from Cornell University, he was a professor at Cornell University, and he specialized in the study of organized crime. And as you'd be able to see, for example, if you were to read his book, this is The Plot to Kill the President, which we're going to get to in a second, where he goes into much greater detail and more specifics about what he's talking about. Because he knew, and he had been very instrumental in doing a lot of the writing and research on the fact that the organized crime community in the United States had actually formed itself into a commission. It was an actual formal commission where they had jurisdiction over certain areas of the country, and that they had responsibility for certain areas of crime, like the heroin and prostitution, etc. And he had gone to great lengths to kind of apply kind of scholarly acumen to the understanding of organized crime. Now, this was quite an uphill climb for him during that time, because J. Edgar Hoover, who had been the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation forever, since basically 1922 or something, all the way up to 1972, for like 50 years, he'd been the director of the FBI, was absolutely adamant that there was no such thing as organized crime. That there had been a period, a short period, he pointed out, when back during Prohibition, there were some people in Chicago and in Detroit, because they were so close to the border in Canada, that there was alcohol coming down from Canada into those cities, and that there was an issue with Prohibition, but it wasn't the same thing as this thing that people kept rumoring about, of there being a thing called the La Cosa Nostra, which is the Sicilian for the family. It's our family. This was all before The Godfather, of course, was around. So J. Edgar Hoover sort of had the central stage, and he kept just saying it isn't true. There's no such thing. And since he was in charge of the major federal investigators, he would never assign them to do that. And so there are two things, he said, in the FBI, there are two things that we're not going to be investigating. One is organized crime, and the other is narcotics. Because if you get into investigating narcotics, then you're definitely going to get corrupted. Because there's so much money in that it's going to corrupt his FBI. So he didn't want to do that. So basically, organized crime got the notion that why don't we do drugs? I mean, like, not Friday night drugs. I mean, like, let's do drugs. And so that's how that thing got going. So G. Robert Blakey had been kind of confronting that kind of effort on the part of J. Edgar Hoover to deny the existence of the organized crime syndicate, and was writing lots of papers and trying to organize symposia and having experts come in to testify about this. And so that they tried, he was working very hard to get them to set up a division inside the Justice Department, aside from the FBI, which used to be is still a part of the Justice Department, but it's got its own complete kind of unique jurisdiction because of J. Edgar Hoover for 50 years. So that they tried to set up an organized crime strike force inside the Justice Department, despite the fact that J. Edgar Hoover kept insisting there was no such thing. And so that Blakey had dug in pretty deeply by the time the Kennedys came into office. And when John and Bobby came into office, Bobby resolved very early, once he discovered that he was the Attorney General, and that and since it was his first job, he wanted to do a good job at it. And so he decided that one of the things that he would do is he would go after organized crime. And the fact that his father had been a major bootlegger and had been involved with Meyer Lansky and a lot of the other major organized crime figures didn't deter him from actually going after them. And so he set up this major organized crime strike force inside the Justice Department. And G. Robert Blakey became, because of his renown in this particular area, became part of that. And was a major driving force in the organized crime strike force inside the Justice Department. So when the decision was made to bring G. Robert Blakey in to be the chief counsel of the, and I guess Greg probably told you some things about the internal fighting that was going on inside the Senate, the House Select Committee, that they had different chairs that were dismissed when Stokes went out, and then they'd throw somebody else out, and then they'd bring in another legal counsel. And it was quite clear that what was going on, like everything else in Washington, D.C., everything that happens in Washington, D.C. is completely political. That there's virtually no principle operating in Washington, D.C. That, as Father Bill Davis used to say to us at the Jesuit headquarters, he said, you know, that first you start by saying that nothing ever happens in Washington just because it's right, and it's the right thing to do. You could say that nothing is ever done that even approximates doing something in the public interest, unless there's some other reason for doing it. And the old maxim was that if the Republicans advocated a piece of legislation to execute everybody in the United States over 6'2", the Democrats would come back with a bill saying, how about 6'4"? And just think of all those people you can save that are between 6'2" and 6'4", that you actually save these people. And if you don't vote for our law to execute everybody over 6'4", you're going to be responsible for all those deaths. Now just think about that. Now that's the kind of ethos that obtains in Washington, D.C. So what happened around this select committee, the only reason that they set it up at all was because the information that was flowing out into the public first from the Watergate Committee and then into the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse, the information that was leaking out about what the Central Intelligence Agency had been doing, and the fact that there was this assassination program going on inside the Central Intelligence Agency, that there had to be something done about it. And so what you could really think in terms of is that the reason for putting the House Select Committee on Assassinations into place was to close off that potential cut artery that was threatening to bleed out all this information into the American public and basically undermine the credibility of our entire national security state apparatus. And so that there had to be some kind of a cauterization of this wound. And so that there were a whole series of people that were part of the coalition that agreed to set up a Senate Select Committee or House Select Committee on Assassinations to try to close off that bleeding. But of course, there were still other people that were very much in the other state of mind of wanting to get that information out in a controlled manner that could actually generate reform of how to reform the intelligence community. What there never was any type of intelligent discussion about what it indicated with the Central Intelligence Agency. That this Central Intelligence Agency was now being found out to be doing things that were exactly what the people who challenged the initial enactment of the National Security Act of 1947 had said was going to happen if you created a group like this. And none of the Republicans and none of the Democrats wanted to have that conversation. They didn't want to actually revisit the entire wisdom of having a Central Intelligence Agency. Because at that time, back in 1979, they were still adequately wedded to the worldview that we're in this dialectical confrontation with the Soviet Union, and they were still buying the rationale that the only reason we set up the National Security Act of 1947 and the CIA and the NSA and all that was simply because the Soviet Union was dedicated to trying to take over the world. And as George Carlin pointed out, that was our job. And so that they actually didn't want to have the conversation about, maybe this isn't such a good idea to have a thing like the Central Intelligence Agency. And so that the coalition that was put together to form the House Select Committee on Assassination was made up of these two elements. The one that was trying to get enough information out to have a significant reform of the Central Intelligence Agency without destroying its credibility so that you'd have to eliminate it. And the other group was basically trying to just shut off the leaking of information about the kind of unlawful and unethical and ultimately dysfunctional activities that the Central Intelligence Agency was engaged in. So the question arises is, well, what kind of a report are you likely to get out of that kind of amalgam of interests? And so that there's a whole lot of drama that went on inside that House Select Committee on Assassinations. And so that they basically punched each other out to the point where they kind of have a neutral ending, where they were right on the verge of coming to this conclusion that, well, even though the Warren Commission didn't necessarily conduct themselves in a thorough manner, even though they seemed to be operating out of an initial bias to assert that Oswald did this and he did this all by himself, and that they weren't engaged in an objective and honest investigation, as it turns out, it just so happens that they turned out to come to the right conclusion. But I say they were right on the brink of having to come to that conclusion and issue that report when the dictabell came out. And as I pointed out, there was this scramble that went on right in the closing weeks of the lifetime, the statutorily granted lifetime of the commission, where they had to do this kind of not a complete 180, but they had to turn away from just a straight affirmation of the Warren Commission report, and so they sort of came halfway. And despite the fact that say, okay, there's another gunman, and so therefore maybe there was a conspiracy. And even though that it isn't completely logical to stop at that point, you would think that you would say there's definitely a conspiracy. The question is the scope of it. But they came up with this thing that was more probable than not that the president had been killed as a result of a conspiracy. And the most likely suspects were a certain element of the Miami-based anti-Castro Cuban exile community, not all of them, but a certain element. And the same thing was true about organized crime. We want to go out of our way to point out that it wasn't all organized crime, because G. Robert Blakey had an opportunity to lay out all of his knowledge about how organized crime was organized, and spent a lot of time doing that, talking about the various syndicates and the various kind of crimes they engaged in, and the history of them, and the evolution from Sicily, and all that kind of stuff. So he basically was using the report as a forum for him getting out a lot of that information that he had been so frustrated over all the years to be getting out. Because of that, on the one hand, he was strutting his stuff to show that it wasn't the entire organized crime commission that made this decision, that it was some other elements, without naming them. So that was, as I say, he thought that was an adequate sea change in the basic issue around the conspiracy, around the assassination, that he thought that was an adequate service. But what he did is, very soon after issuing the report, he rushed right over to Dick Billings, who was the chief staff writer for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, because what had happened is they had assigned different groups inside the staff to take a look at potential other suspects. As soon as they got to this thing of saying that, well, there's a number of suspects, so what they did is they had a group look at organized crime, they had a group look at the Miami-based anti-Castro Cuban community. There were some rumors about the mafia in the assassination activities that they were engaged in against Castro had some kind of very troublesome lines of communication going on with the Central Intelligence Agency. And so they had some people look at the Central Intelligence Agency to see what degree they might have been responsible for the killing of the president. And then there were some rumors about the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so they had some people take a look at that. And it turns out that what happened is each one of those groups came to the conclusion that their group did it. That's true. That's what happened. And so what they did is they all handed in their final papers next Tuesday. We'll be getting those back. But they handed in their final papers, each one of them saying that their group did it, and listing out all the evidence that was very, very persuasive as to their having done it. And of course, being good advocates, they created a whole narrative as to why they believe their group did it. And so G. Robert Blakey calls in Dick Billings, who's charged with responsibility for writing up this report. And what G. Robert Blakey says is, look, given the fact that they all say their group did it, I'm going to exercise my executive authority, and I'm going to say that organized crime did it, basically. But they made use of the Miami-based Cuban exile people. But it was primarily the organized crime element that did this. And they also manipulated and drew in Oswald to participate in this rather unknowingly. That he didn't realize that he was part of a much larger thing, that somehow they just kind of ended up goading him into doing this as a scapegoat. And so what he did is, after they got the report prepared, he sat down with Richard Billings and they wrote this. This is the plot to kill the president. Now this is the most definitive single articulation of the full-scale organized crime theory. And so it's basically perceived in tandem with the final report of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was much more nuanced and conditional about what it is they were saying. That this is really understood to be basically what it is that they were saying in the House Select Committee, even though they didn't say it. But this is it.
Does that tie back to Jimmy Hoffa or no?
Yes. So what happens is once G. Robert Blakey, got the bit in his teeth, and he was in charge of writing a book, instead of having to deal with all of the kind of different factions that were inside the House Select Committee on Assassinations, he just took off just like a big bird and started saying, let me tell you all about what I know about organized crime. Let me tell you who the different elements are and how smart I am and how much work I put into this. And a whole bunch of the book has to do with that. But then he gets down into saying, look at, once we've made the decision that it was this element of organized crime, he said, then let's see what the full implications were. And what he did is he had information from Johnny Roselli. Johnny Roselli had gotten himself in some trouble. Johnny, let me tell you a little bit about some of these. You've heard their names a little bit before, but who G. Robert Blakey said that were that certain element of organized crime. It was Santos Trafficante, who was the mafia don in Havana, all the way up until January 1st of 1959, when Castro ousted Batista. And Santos Trafficante and his whole crowd fled up into Tampa and in the Miami area. And they immediately set up an exile group that was going to try to figure out how to take back Cuba from the communists, right? Now, the fact is that they wanted to get their gambling casinos back, and their houses of prostitution back, and their heroin trafficking back. And that was their actual motive. But so that a lot of these guys that were in the rabid anti-communist community of the exiles in Miami were actually organized crime operatives. They were employees, actually, of Santos Trafficante. They were gunmen that helped protect the heroin trafficking, that helped enforce the security around the houses of prostitution, and the gambling casinos. So these were criminals. They weren't just ideologically driven. They were criminal elements. And these groups, because they were so virulent about wanting to overthrow the new Cuban government that came in there, they ended up being selected by the Central Intelligence Agency once it was tasked by Richard Nixon to attempt to disrupt and neutralize the new revolutionary government in Cuba. So what you had is this operation, this covert operation being run under the auspices of the Central Intelligence Agency, under the direction of Richard Nixon, basically, called Operation 40, where they set up these 5 bases that I told you about, the one at No Name Key in Swan Island, and the one in the Everglades, and the 2 of them at Lake Pontchartrain. And what they were doing is they were attacking the island and burning the sugar crops and blowing up bridges and poisoning sugar shipments to the Soviet Union, and trying to basically knock out the economic effectiveness of the place, and to just terrorize the place, to try to demonstrate to the citizens of the new revolutionary Cuban government that the Castro government was unable to provide adequate security for them. And so therefore the people should not trust them, should not give their allegiance to them. And so that what happened is you had this CIA operation going on. It was made up substantially of criminals that were Santos Trafficante's gunmen and criminal elements that were actually engaged in the attempt to undermine the government in Cuba. And so needless to say, because of that, this is the group out of which arose the decision to try to put together a group to assassinate Castro. And I've touched upon it before, but what I want to do is I want to point out how persuasive, as you know, I want to do this about each one of these specific alternative theories, and since the House Select Committee on Assassination is not really a full-blown affirmative theory, it's an actual assertion that it's different than the affirmative theory of the lone gunman, and all they're saying is that it's probably true. It's a little vague about exactly who did it. The first full-blown alternative thesis to the lone gunman theory is the mafia plot. The mafia plot to kill the president. And what they did is they targeted this group, saying that, look, we now know, they began to find out about the stuff that I had been told about back in May of 1973. Now this is up in 1977, 78, before the 1979 release of the report. But they were finding out some 6 years later, basically the stuff that I had been told by Trafficante back in May of 1973, when we were trying to figure out what happened in the Watergate burglary. What are these 3 Miami Cubans doing in the DNC? Why is Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis? Why are they the guys that are coordinating these people? If you look into who these people are, these people have a big long track record of having been involved back in 1960, in 61, 62, in these violent attempts to overthrow the government of Castro. And given the fact that I had been told that these people, when Richard Nixon, as I touched on before, once he realized that he was going to get the Republican nomination for the presidency in June of 1960, he reached out to Howard Hughes, and who he had this covert relationship with in the National Security Council, and asked him to put together an assassination team to actually assassinate Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara, and in fact 5 other of the major leaders of the new revolutionary government of Cuba. And that he wanted to do that to show that he was fully muscled up, and if he was lucky, he could get Castro killed before the election in November. And so during the month of June and July and into September, all the way into September, they had these series of meetings. And when Howard Hughes decided he was going to respond in the affirmative to Vice President Nixon's request to create this assassination team, but to keep it away from the president, referring to himself, as he began to do in the third person once he knew he was going to get the nomination. Because he was confident that he was going to be able to beat this little pipsqueak from Massachusetts, whose father had basically bought him a Senate seat. And so he was sure he was going to win, so he moved forward, referring to himself basically as the president, giving directives to these people to put the assassination team together to keep it away from the president and the White House. And so the fact that Howard Hughes had as one of his principal lawyers, Robert Mayhew, becomes very important here, because Robert Mayhew is a man who was familiar with the organized crime community, because he had worked in the past working with Nixon. And Richard Nixon had all kinds of contacts with the organized crime community. Richard Nixon's entire history tracks back into the organized crime community. And there's a whole other thing we could get into about that. But the bottom line is that Mayhew, working for Howard Hughes, reaches out to Johnny Roselli, who was the bagman, basically, for Sam Giancana in the Chicago organized crime family in Las Vegas. The organized crime family owned the Sands and the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, two of the major operations. And all of Las Vegas had basically been created as a major project by Bugsy Siegel, sort of beginning after World War II, from 1947, 48. He got into working off the West Coast and basically created this kind of den of iniquity. And it was exactly that. I mean, that Las Vegas by about 1960 was kind of a modern day version of Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, it was a fairly serious place. I remember, when was it that I went there first? But it was like that when I went there the first time. I ended up driving through there one time, and I went there, and it was just incredible. I mean, that there was prostitution all over on the streets. I mean, but high class stuff. I mean, not real dingy stuff. I mean, really high class stuff. And they had these big nifty nightclubs with striptease dancing, and they had gambling going, and everybody was drunk on their ass. Like by about nightfall, every single night. I mean, every single night was like the weekend. I mean, like, weekends are okay for that stuff, but I mean, for like Tuesdays and Wednesday nights, it was like that all the time. And so what happened is that because Howard Hughes by this time was ensconced upstairs at the Sands Hotel, he gets Bob Mayhew, his lawyer, to go meet with Johnny Roselli, so Mayhew says to Johnny Roselli, as I mentioned before, says, look at, you guys have got your own reasons for wanting to get rid of Castro down there. But Nixon wants you to knock this guy off and knock him out of power so that everybody can get back into Havana and get back to having things like it's supposed to be, and we can basically what Havana was like the precursor to Las Vegas, with the gambling casinos, the prostitution, the heroin, and everything that was going on down there. And so that they were trying to get Havana reopened. So he said, you got your own reasons for wanting to do this, so why don't you guys do this? Do this for the president. But you got to keep it away from the president. You got to keep it away from the White House so nobody assumes that that's who's doing this. And so Johnny Roselli, as I mentioned, they have a second set of meetings out at the Brown Derby out in Los Angeles, which was Johnny Roselli's other kind of base of operations, because he was involved in Hollywood movies and things. Eventually got sent to prison, actually, for a $2 million embezzlement operation against one of the movie studios. But the bottom line is, they go to Chicago. Johnny Roselli goes to Chicago and sits down with Sam Giancana and says to Sam Giancana, Nixon wants this assassination team put together and wants us to do it and keep it away from him. This could be beneficial to all of us. We could knock off the Cuban government. We could get back into power. Do a favor for Nixon. He'd be indebted to us even more than he is now. So this could be good all around. And so Sam Giancana says, yeah, but this is Santos's territory down there. That's Santos's territory, down in Havana and down in Miami. So we're gonna have to go down and talk to him. So they go down and talk to him. And they have a meeting on September 24th of 1960 at the Fontainebleau Hotel. And they have a long discussion about this. Santo Trafficante, Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli, and Bob Mayhew. And after 2 of these meetings, they decide in principle that they're willing to do this. And Sam Giancana, in his conversations with Santos Trafficante, Santos says, as he said to us, he says, I didn't fall off no melon, he said. So he says, I'm not going to just stick my neck out and put together this assassination group and then get hung out for it. Oops, sorry about that. That's what happens when you get off the plane too fast. Okay. So the bottom line is that the bottom line is that Santos Trafficante says, I know how we're going to protect ourselves, and this becomes critical. This very specific decision made by Santos Trafficante explains 75% of everything that you're going to run into, which has to do with confusion around the assassination of President Kennedy. So I want you to listen to this again. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's so important. What Santos Trafficante said is, look, if Nixon wants us, the bent noses, to do this deed for him, I'm going to do it in such a way that I'm going to box them in. And so that if we get caught doing this, they are going to be covering for us. And so what he did is he said, I'm going to put the people on the assassination team to kill Castro and Che Guevara and the other guys who are my gunmen from my previous work down in Havana, who are now working for the Central Intelligence Agency in Operation 40. And that way, if anybody starts sniffing them out and thinking that they may have done this thing, people are going to say, well, maybe it's the agency that did it. And the agency will have to cover for us. So that's what he did. He picks 15 guys. Rafael Chichi Quintero, Ricardo Chavez, Rolando Martinez, the Villaverde brothers. There's a whole group of them, all of them that were former assassins and killers and stuff for him down in Havana. And he brings them in to the S-Force. And as I mentioned to you before, he spreads them out into these 5 bases, these 5 paramilitary bases. He spreads them all out. And so you got a couple of them on Swan Island with Frank Sturgis. You got a few of them on No Name Key. You got them over in the Everglades with E. Howard Hunt working there. You got them over Lake Pontchartrain, both on the southern end and the northern end of Lake Pontchartrain. And what they do is that in order to train them to be specialized assassins, to be able to kill Castro, what they do is they send private planes around and pick them up and fly them to Fort Huachuca. You remember me mentioning that? They fly them to Fort Huachuca, which is this big Army electronic intelligence gathering base. Lots of security around it, lots of national security, from their point of view, legitimate protections around the place. They fly them all in, they sign them in, and then they all disappear. And what they do is they take them and they fly them down to Mexico, down to Oaxaca, Mexico, to the ranch of Clinton Murchison Jr., who is a private, wealthy millionaire whose dad owns the Santa Anita racetrack out in California. And they also own the Dallas Texans. And that he has this big ranch down in Oaxaca. And what they do is they set up a base down there for training these 15 guys who they codenamed the S-Force. And this group is going to be training on shooting a person in a moving vehicle with triangular, high-power, telescopic rifles. It's the triangular fire team base. And what happens is that, as I mentioned, in order to fund that operation, Trafficante told us that what they did is the mob began to take a skim off the casinos, the Sands and the Desert Inn, out in Vegas in cash, and they would put it into these expensive suitcases, put them into the back trunks of Cadillac automobiles, and drive them from Las Vegas through New Orleans to Miami, and they would deposit the cash in the Miami National Bank that was owned and run by Meyer Lansky, the big kind of financial wizard of the mafia. And then they would wire some of that money into the International Credit Bank in Geneva, Switzerland, under the direction of a guy by the name of Guillaume there. And then they would wire some of that money down into the Banco Internacional down in Mexico City into a particular bank account of an attorney by the name of Manuel Agario. And the money from that account was used to finance the training activities of this triangular fire team base. And that entire operation got into operation from September, October into November. They were getting themselves set up and getting ready to get trained, these guys, when suddenly Richard Nixon didn't get elected. And it's important to remember that one of the principal reasons why they didn't get elected, is because of 10,000 votes that were fraudulently stolen by the Cook County Democratic Party machine under the control of Boss Daley and under the control of Sam Giancana in Chicago. So Sam Giancana viewed himself as having done a special favor for the Kennedys to win that race and take Cook County and therefore take Illinois. And so that victory put Kennedy in office. And so when you look to the history that Santos Trafficante is telling us about, how back in 1960 he was instrumental, he and Sam Giancana were instrumental in setting up the assassination team to kill Fidel Castro, that becomes critical about this. Yes?
Was that the first time it was revealed that he got those votes for the Democratic Party?
Well, Trafficante told us about it, and there have been all kinds of rumors flying. After you have a close election like that, there's going to be all kinds of people screaming about, oh, there was this fraud here and that fraud there, and sometimes it's more true than others. But there was a very high level of assumption that was probably true afoot in the country. And Richard Nixon, because he ended up losing by effectively 10,000 votes, losing Illinois and therefore losing the Electoral College, he figured that he was going to be able to come back in 1964, run against Kennedy again, so he didn't want to look like a whiner. He didn't want to look like a whiner or a loser, and so he didn't challenge it. He just sort of laid back and let that one happen. And so when this information started to get discovered during the House Select Committee on Assassinations, once it became clear to G. Robert Blakey that there had in fact been a conspiracy because of the second shooter that was revealed on the dicta belt, according to his understanding of it. He then dug in and he brought to bear his entire worldview about organized crime and looking at what the likely conspiracy was here. He came in with as firm a bias on behalf of this having been organized crime as J. Edgar Hoover and the Warren Commission had been biased in favor of saying that it was a lone gunman who was a communist. That would have been completely consistent with their reactionary worldview. And so what G. Robert Blakey did in constructing the first full-scale alternative narrative of what the assassination was really all about, comes up with this narrative that is not coincidentally a complete function of his worldview. And he looks out across the information, and since there's adequate evidence, if you perceive it in the exact right way, to show what the mob had done, because he starts finding out all this information. Because Johnny Roselli had gotten really jealous, and because he was working with the CIA people. There were actually CIA people, a guy named Carl Jenkins, was actually doing a lot of the training of these guys. So you start to get this amalgamation of organized crime people, organized crime money being used to finance the training. They're at this private base owned by a big rich guy, and you've got a trainer like Carl Jenkins, who's a Central Intelligence Agency guy, actually down at the base training this assassination team, okay? And so you're starting to see the CIA kind of getting intertwined with this, even though the instructions were to keep it away from the White House, and not to let them know that this was a White House operation, or a CIA operation. And so because of this information, what happened is Johnny Roselli was constantly taking advantage of the fact that he had this relationship with the CIA, and that and Sam Giancana knew about this as well. And so what happened is Sam Giancana got really jealous. You know, like this story. He got really jealous over one of the McGuire sisters, who you don't have any idea who they are. But the McGuire sisters were this kind of stacked-haired, shellac-haired singing group that were all the rage in the 50s. And Sam Giancana had gotten to meet the McGuire sisters because they were performing out in Las Vegas, and he was hanging around with Frank Sinatra, and Sinatra introduced them to them. So he was having this, Sam Giancana was having this, as torrid as he could manage, affair with this, one of the McGuire sisters, and she started dating, he started hearing that she was dating Dan Rowan of Rowan and Martin, who you also don't know who they are. But Rowan and Martin were this comedy team that used to appear in Las Vegas. And Dan Rowan started dating, they all like to use that phrase back in the 50s. They were dating, and so Sam Giancana got upset about it. He wanted to find out if it was true, so he got Johnny Roselli to lean on the CIA to give him electronic wiretapping equipment, which they put into her apartment to listen in on what they were doing together. It turns out that the guy that they hired to do it got caught by the police doing it. And so and then he started singing and saying that, well, it was Johnny Roselli that put me up to it. And I think it was Sam Giancana that was having the affair with her, because he used to have his picture taken with her every time he could. And so that all of a sudden this big investigation broke out, where there was an investigation going on about an illegal wiretapping operation, looking for where the equipment came from. And there was a danger they were going to discover that it was CIA equipment. And, you know, what is this guy doing with CIA equipment? And so that the pressure came on them. And so what happened is Johnny Roselli basically began to graymail them. In order to get the charges dropped against him, he started hinting that in fact maybe the government ought to drop these charges against him, because if he had to explain where he got the wiretapping equipment, he'd probably have to explain the role he had in setting up the assassination team to kill Castro, and he thought he could graymail them, could push them back from doing this. So that whole operation started going on, and what he started doing is he started leaking information to Jack Anderson, who you also don't know who he is. Jack Anderson was a very prominent columnist in Washington, D.C. That he was actually the progeny of Drew Pearson, who was in turn the progeny of Walter Winchell, who were these classic investigator guys that were in Washington, D.C., that were constantly digging around in Washington and trying to figure out what scandals were going on, political scandals. And so Jack Anderson started getting information from Johnny Roselli, leaking information to him about the role that Johnny Roselli was playing in setting up an assassination team to kill Castro. So that what happened is that because of the leaks of this information that Jack Anderson had put in his little column called the Merry-Go-Round in the national papers, which was basically being ignored, except that it was scaring everybody in Washington. Because all the people that knew about the fact that the CIA was engaging in political assassination activities and had been overthrowing democratically elected governments around the world, that the people outside of Washington didn't know that. But most of the people inside Washington did know about it. And they were letting it happen because both political parties thought it was a good idea. And so what happened is that you had a lot of this information leaking around, and so when G. Robert Blakey ends up turning on the green light to go looking into an investigation about organized crime, having been involved in the assassination of the president, he has all this rich information flowing around about them having been involved in the assassination of Castro. And they first started pushing the theory that Castro found out about the assassination operations. And what they had done, Johnny Roselli was feeding information to Jack Anderson, lying and saying that it was the Kennedys that had put it together. And he wasn't admitting that it was Richard Nixon. And he didn't talk about the fact that Howard Hughes had done this as a favor for Richard Nixon at Nixon's request. Didn't talk about it. He just said that the Kennedy brothers had put together the assassination team that killed Castro. And so what they were doing is he was putting the pressure on because he wanted the liberals in Washington who wouldn't want to reveal the fact that the Kennedys had been planning to kill Castro, which was not true, would help shut down the criminal investigation against him. But G. Robert Blakey gloms onto this information and starts digging into it, and he comes up with the understanding that this group is the one that killed the president. And so what he does is he starts putting into this book the details of this. And so instead of just referring to a certain element of Miami-based anti-Castro Cubans, he starts talking specifically about the 2506 Brigade, Alpha 66. He starts talking about the people that were involved in this assassination group. He starts constantly talking about them as being Trafficante gunmen. And so that the certain element of organized crime that he's talking about in the report, but goes into much more detail about, is Santo Trafficante in the Havana-based mafia, along with Sam Giancana. Okay? And so what happens is the House Select Committee on Assassinations, actually the Church Committee, which was still in business, the Church Committee issues a subpoena for Sam Giancana. And Sam Giancana takes 7 bullets in the back of the head and in the mouth when he was just after he got through having a nice dinner party at his house, and is very dead. And then, I mean, of course, that's 1975. That was on July 23rd, 1975. And by this time, I was down at Jesuit headquarters in Washington, D.C. I remember I heard the news, and I was saying, whew, that's that same thing that Trafficante was talking about. That's Giancana. That's the guy that he said worked with them to set up the assassination.
Just real quick, he appeared twice,
Yes,
and it was his 3rd appearance.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So he'd been in there. He'd been in there, and what he did is he refused to talk to them. They brought him in. He refused to answer any of their questions. What they did is they dragged him up in front of a federal judge and got him immunity, and then brought him back into the grand jury. He still refused to talk, and so the judge put him in federal prison until such time as he was willing to testify. Held him in contempt of court and put him in federal prison. And it's long and complicated, but a federal grand jury lasts for 18 months. And so as long as the life of the grand jury is still operative, the person who's been put into the prison, trying to make them testify, can be kept in the prison until the termination of that grand jury. So Sam Giancana was, the grand jury had already been in session for 6 months when they subpoenaed him. And so that what happened then is he ends up spending like 12 months in jail. Sam Giancana, the boss of the mob in Chicago. And the grand jury expires, so he's released and he flees. He flees and goes down to Mexico, lives in this big secure compound down in Cuernavaca. And he hangs out down there, and after 8 years, he can't stand it anymore. And so what he does, he comes back to the United States. Well, actually, he gets deported by the Mexican government. Because he had failed to pay the $2,000 a week that he was paying to bribe all the officials. And so they deported him back to the United States, and waiting for them there at the airport in Chicago is a subpoena for him again. And so they get ready to bring him back in before the committee to talk with him, and he gets shot and killed. Okay, and so I knew right when that happened. I knew what was happening because I knew who he was, and I knew what the committee was looking for. And so I called Billy Taylor, my investigator who'd been in the room with me when we started the investigation with Trafficante. And I said, somebody should take out a life insurance policy on Johnny Roselli. And they could make a mint on this thing, because this guy's probably not gonna last the year. We were wrong, he lasted 13 months actually, and he got killed when he was subpoenaed to come in front of the committee as well. And so both of these guys are killed.
Did he talk though, somewhat?
He was talking to Jack Anderson. And Jack Anderson was revealing information in his reports, but he kept trying to convince all the organized crime people that he wasn't the source of this to Jack Anderson, and that he wasn't talking to the people when they were bringing him in front of the committee. He wasn't telling them anything, but somehow Jack Anderson kept getting more and more of this information and revealing it, and so that they killed him. And this completely convinced G. Robert Blakey that it was Trafficante who was behind doing this. Because if you've got both Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana both killed, and Santos Trafficante was the other main guy that was involved in making the decisions, he's figuring he's the guy doing this, right? And so he comes to the conclusion that Santos Trafficante is the guy who was the domo in deciding to kill the president. And this is what he says. He says it here. So his conclusion is that Santos Trafficante ordered the killing of the president, and of course, once he comes to that decision, he brings to bear all of the knowledge he has about the history of organized crime and what he was doing. So he goes into great detail in here about how Bobby Kennedy was going after the organized crime people. He had chased Santos Trafficante around. He was threatening to get Trafficante deported again, and that there was a trial going on threatening to deport him. And so what he does is he creates a fully consistent, internally, self-referentially consistent narrative of how it was that Santos Trafficante participated in making the decision to kill the president. And he used the team that was put together to kill Fidel Castro so that it would have the exact same effect as he'd originally intended it to have if they killed Castro. Is that anybody who starts getting too close to that team, figuring out what's going on, are going to say, oh, this is the agency. This is the CIA that did this.
By the time Fonzie did the second version of the book in 2008, he had talked to, and he talks about it to Bob Blakey, and Blakey had changed his mind and said if he were to do it over again, the first thing he would have checked was the connections between Oswald and the CIA.
Oh yeah, no.
So
That's way ahead of us.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
You know, because what you'll notice when I know that you guys now, inspired as you are, will probably run out and try to find the last remaining copies of this, of The Plot to Kill the President by G. Robert Blakey with Richard Billings. And what you'll notice is that as you're going through the thing, he keeps at this point in time, he keeps listing all of the reasons why a person who is doing a normal investigation would ask these questions about organized crime. But he doesn't ever ask those questions about the CIA. Yes?
So that's your co-author as well?
Pardon?
That's your co-author?
Yeah, that's because Billings knows better now.
Yeah.
And so then what I've said is that, look, since this is the most credible book around about the first in principle alternative theory to the lone gunman theory, this has to be replaced.
So what your book says is that this book has the right people, but not the right people behind it, not the right.
It does say that.
Okay.
It does say that. And so but what he says is he says this whole kind of really interesting things when he starts talking about saying that he starts saying things like, you know, who would gain from this? And he says, well, of course, organized crime would gain from this. But he ignores the fact that the Central Intelligence Agency would gain from this. They just gotten fired. I mean, they just fired Alan Dulles in Cabell. He was talking about breaking up the Central Intelligence Agency in 1,000 pieces and casting it to the winds. And he goes on and on, and virtually every single one of these so-called neutral principles, he says, for example, he says, now, he says, okay, who is it that kills people? Well, it's organized crime, right? Doesn't say anything about the Central Intelligence Agency, even though he's got all this information about this massive assassination program going on, you know, overthrowing governments and killing people all over the place. So he asked these questions as though the answer were obvious. And yet, the other candidates, you know, how about the military killing people? You know, how about the Central Intelligence Agency killing people? You know, they've got professional snipers. They have sniper schools that kill people. But he doesn't ask those questions. He just keeps automatically gravitating back to his worldview and filling in the information, saying that clearly, when you ask that obvious question, the answer is organized crime. And since he's got this direct information coming in from Johnny Roselli and the other people, that here's the guys that were involved in setting up the assassination team, he's got the perfect assassination team, and it turns out that he's entirely correct. that is the assassination team that did it. And yes, they were gunmen that were in fact working for Santos Trafficante up until the time they came to work for the Central Intelligence Agency. Okay? And so it's that old thing that he's right as far as that goes. But what we've got here, just sort of in conclusion, we're at the spot now. What we've got now is the second fully articulated, internally, self-referentially consistent narrative of the assassination. That it's no longer the lone gunman. And it's not just what the committee said is maybe, it's more likely than not it was a conspiracy, and more likely than not it was this guy and that guy. He's saying who it is and laying the whole thing out and explaining it.
So they say that the whole entire shooting was done by the S-Force, and so Oswald
That's
was
right.
not involved, so they were on the grass.
No. He actually then says that what the S-Force had done is they had figured out that there's a classic way that organized crime, and he actually goes into detail of other instances where organized crime will set up an assassination and set up a fall guy. They frame him up to take the fall for this thing. And he goes in, gives historical examples about the mayor of an Illinois town was killed, and they set up some doofus to take the fall for it. And he goes into that stuff. And so what he's basically saying is that he asserts that Oswald did do the shooting, but that there was another gunman that was an organized crime gunman, which was part of this S-Force, that was part of the organized crime people that worked with Santos Trafficante, who were going to kill Castro. And this whole group came together, and they basically kind of nudged Oswald up into position to do this. And actually goes so far as to say that Oswald didn't even plan to kill the president until after Oswald had tried to kill Walker, General Walker, in April of 1963. And so but the Cuban people saw him. And he doesn't actually say it, but as it turns out, that what the assassination team, the S-Force, was doing in planning to kill Castro, while they were on that mission, is they were planning to set up Oswald to take the fall for it. And so what they did is they had the chump already picked out, and so what they did is when they did the 180 to go after the president, they just laid it into him and stimulated him to get him to kill him.
So they're saying there was a shooter on the grassy knoll?
Yes, it's quite bizarre. What he's saying is, yes, there was a shooter on the grassy knoll, but the shooter on the grassy knoll missed.
But it was an S-Force.
An S-Force killer.
It was someone who was trained for however long to assassinate someone and then missed.
And you kind of wonder how at 111 feet, you know, with a telescopic sight, how he missed the president when allegedly Oswald, who was at least a questionable shot, could actually hit him 2 out of 2 shots. Yep. Well, it's interesting.
Worse. It's
Pardon?
worse.
Yeah.
Because when they reran the test, because the Warren Commission ran the test to find out how fast you could fire 2 shots together, they came up with 2.3 seconds.
Yeah.
Blakey and those guys ran the test, but the only way they could make it faster was to take the scope off. So they put it down to 1.66 seconds. They got one guy who could do it that fast.
When it was nailed down.
Scopeless.
With no scope on it.
Well, it wasn't just that. When he did it, on the second shot, no one could hit they couldn't hit the broadside of the barn in the second
Yeah.
shot. Because after doing it to get at the time in, you couldn't,
Yeah.
there's no way to sight it.
That's right.
But
And,
that's,
and so Blakey himself, once he gets on this galloping horse of going in the direction of it being, he sets up this scenario, and he himself has completely fallacious, factual assertions in there, just like the Warren Commission did.
Why would they state that the shooter from the grassy knoll missed when it very well could have been the shooter that, on the grassy knoll that killed Kennedy, because there was the entrance room? So why were they I feel like there's some sort of protection.
It's a really interesting question, because actually Blakey goes to great lengths to point out, he has this really kind of interesting dramatic scenario, how the person on the grassy knoll, when he fired the shot that missed, the shot that exploded the president's head actually was like 1/7 of a second after the shot that Oswald shot. And so therefore, when this guy shot, the sound of his own rifle going off masked the shot that Oswald shot, so the guy on the grassy knoll thought he hit it. He thought he's the one that did it. And so it's kind of bizarre, because it's obviously not true, because the fact of the matter is, the first shot that they attribute to Oswald is the one that hit the president in the back, and allegedly hit Governor Connolly. And then they say that the first shot was the one that missed the car entirely, the very first one. So that his timing, his assertion about the 7/10 of a second isn't even true.
I thought the Warren Commission didn't say which shot missed. I thought that was kind of left up in the air as far as the Warren Commission.
No, what they
well,
said.
at the end, they eventually said it was irrelevant. But in the beginning, they said the first.
Because I read something that said that the Warren Commission left it sort of
And then
ambiguous.
At the end, they said it didn't matter.
That's
They
right.
just said, oh, it doesn't matter.
It clearly did. It did matter, because there was that fundamental problem with it. Is how can he have missed by 270 feet, the entire limousine, when it's the closest to him, and then the next two shots hit right within a 6-inch circle, of hitting the president. Doesn't make any sense. And so that the question, the way Blakey dealt with that is saying, well, what makes sense is that the shot that missed him and went past the limousine and hit the curb for Jack Teague and hit him with the flying shrapnel.
There's, you know this, but I'm just saying,
Yeah.
there's multiple theories that indicate that there were two shots, that one simultaneously hit the back of his head, just like boom, boom, one in the back, one in the front at the
Yeah.
same time. There's multiple people.
Yeah, so again, the point that I'm making here is that what we see is that a lot of the same weaknesses that were characteristic of the Warren Commission report, that they get caught in a worldview of trying to affirm the worldview that this was all part of the Cold War, it was a communist that killed the president, and that makes all sense of it, or his worldview that it was all organized crime. Once they get into that, they start distorting facts. They start ignoring things that are inconsistent with it. They misread facts. They put facts in that are not even really true. And so he's done the same thing here. But it's important to tell you in closing before we take our break, is that this actually stands at the present time as the most definitive alternative scenario to the killing of the president, other than Oswald did it as a lone gunman. This theory of organized crime, Santos Trafficante, having that team that was put together to kill Castro, turn and kill the president, and then get concealed by the fact that the Central Intelligence Agency, just as Trafficante had hoped, didn't dare expose that and would come in with all their resources to conceal it because they thought that if it was revealed as to who had done it, that it would track back to the Central Intelligence Agency. And they knew that there was enough evidence around as to why the Central Intelligence Agency might have had the motive and the means and the opportunity to do this, that they took steps to roll into place their not inconsiderable resources to conceal who it was that did this. Okay? So let's stick with the kids up till we, okay, so that we can take our break now. Now, also, I wanna ask you now, if you guys, it is kind of a special night. I know that you guys may have, people wanna go do Halloween things. It's not exactly a high holy day,
But isn't Santa Cruz?
Depends.
What we'll do is when we come back from the break, that what we'll do, when is it goes till?
6 to 7, 10.
Am I stop? Oh no, we're in our discussion group for our regular class now. Okay, then when we take our break, why don't we do this? Why don't we take a break now?